Thank you. It's exciting to be here again. I feel like I was just here a few months ago interviewing, so it's a different experience to be here now. I'm excited to speak with you today. The guidance that I was given for this session was to basically share with you what I'm doing with my research, what I'm interested in, and to give you kind of you as students a place to kind of understand where I'm coming from, but also to see if there are any opportunities for collaboration. So I'm going to warn you right now, this is not going to be a model instructional experience. There's going to be overload. Because my goal here is to really just lay everything out on the table that I'm doing, things that I'm interested in doing. And so if you feel a little overloaded, good, that's kind of the intention. But if something's not interesting to you, hold on for a second, because I'll probably talk about something else. But my goal in doing this is to try to give you a broad kind of understanding of how I see the world and just the kind of the themes that I'm interested in exploring as I approach, this area of technology and education. My website's available as well. I'll bring this back up at the end. So basically all the things I'm going to talk about are things that I've either already done research on or that I'm doing it on. So if something's interesting, you can go to my website and you can find publications about it and that kind of stuff if you want more information. So for just a quick intro, we live in a really interesting time. So the majority of us have smartphones. The majority of us have some kind of computing device, so a desktop computer, a laptop computer, and it boggles the mind to think about how much more processing power we have, data processing power each of us individually has than people who have come before us. If we look back to 1942, when the Allies won World War II, the Allied forces all together had less computing power than you have in your smartphone. And yet, what were they able to accomplish? Fast forward a little bit to 1969, the Apollo missions, when NASA put a man on the moon, or men on the moon. Your smartphone has more processing power than NASA had at that time. And look what they were able to accomplish. And yet, when we have so much processing power, what do we do with these tools? Well, we play higher fidelity video games, for one. Hopefully we do other things as well. In addition to the processing power, we also have access to more information than any generation in history. So you can go right now on your smartphone or tablet or computer and you can gain access to more information than Jane Austen, John Dewey, Sir Isaac Newton, or Marie Curie had access to in their entire lives. And yet what do we do with that information? Well, we use it to stalk people on Facebook. And then also, we have access to more creative works than anyone has ever had access to in history. You can go to a website like Digital Public Library of America, which gives you access, which is a repository for all the public domain content on the web that they can find. So all classical works of literature, all classical works of art, everything is there. And yet, what do we spend our time doing? Well, we watch Gangnam Style videos. Well, this is fascinating to me. How many views has this single video had? Can you see it up here?
2.2 billion.
2.4 billion. So if we look at that in perspective of the world, that's 1 in 3 people in the world has seen that video, if it actually represented one person for each video or whatever, or each view. But that's mind-boggling how many people have seen that single video. In addition to that, people like this video. A lot of people have liked this video. Over 9.8 million people have gone on and clicked the button to say, I like this video. For perspective, if Psy was running for president in 1916, he would have beaten Woodrow Wilson. He's gotten more votes than Woodrow Wilson needed to become president of the US for that one video. And that's fascinating to me. And, as I bring up those things, the question that follows is this bad? Are we using the internet in a bad way? Well, no, but I think we need to think about these resources that we have and are we using them to their full potential? Because we still live in a world that is fraught with problems. In education, in particular, we are facing many of the same problems that we've always faced. We see headlines like there's been no real progress in grade school reading in 20 years. We still have a problem of the K-16 pipeline. We have issues of bad tech integration in schools. LA Unified School District made national news recently because they spent over $1 billion on an iPad initiative. And basically the justification was this: we're going to give each kid an iPad and then they're going to magically learn and they're going to bring themselves out of poverty. Did that happen? No, it didn't. And so they then sued Apple to get their money back because apparently Apple, they thought, made promises that they didn't keep. So in this process, I don't think we should be looking to technology for the answer. I don't think there's an answer hidden in the computer somewhere. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that technology can serve as a catalyst for change. It can get us to rethink some of our traditional problems or our approaches to addressing them and empower us to creatively think about the world that we live in and how we address those problems. So that catalyst can either be a catalyst for good, so it can help us to solve problems and improve our lives, but it can also be a catalyst for bad. It can lead to unexpected consequences. So I'm going to talk through really 3 areas of interest that my research is gravitated toward, and we'll spend some time with each. The first is mediated identities, second is open literacies, and the third is web as data. And if these don't make any sense to you, that's fine. They probably don't make any sense to anyone. First is mediated identities. So anyone recognize what this is? Anyone know? It's not the Globe Theater. It's the opposite. It's a prison. It's a panopticon designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. The idea was to design a prison where the warden could sit in the center, watch everyone without anyone knowing that they're being watched. And this was then adopted as a metaphor by Foucault in talking about modern societies and how power structures are put in place to basically keep those in power. Now, we have kind of a lot of this kind of conversation still occurring, this critical conversation occurring when we talk about NSA and privacy and things like that. And no matter how you feel about Edward Snowden and some of the people that have done things in this area, I think there's a really good point that Snowden makes here. He says, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. And so we live in a world where privacy is no longer assumed, and it's not only no longer assumed, it's kind of assumed that you don't have any privacy. And this is a problem in a top-down manner, kind of a big brother perspective. But the other side of this that we don't talk about as much, that doesn't make public headlines, is this lateral surveillance that we do of one another. We watch each other. And we watch each other in ways that we haven't had the capacity to do before. We make judgments about each other in ways that we haven't been able to in the past. So I can watch all of you by Googling you, by following you on Facebook, by following you on Twitter, and you can do the same. So what social media in particular, and a lot of these technologies have done, is they have allowed us to watch each other more easily and draw conclusions about each other more easily. And I think there are some implications of that we need to consider. So right now, you could Google me, and you could find out more information about me than probably biblical scholars have been able to find out about Christ in 2,000 years. So there's just so much information about each of us online that anyone can have access to that it's incredible to think, what's there. Now, I've been interested in this question in terms of teachers and what do teachers need to understand about privacy? What do they need to understand about professionalism to be successful in the world today? And I think it's important for us to kind of think about teachers as an example of this, but these same principles apply to lots of different settings. So teachers, like many professions, have certain professional standards that they must abide by. So they're held to the legal law, obviously, so like they can't have romantic relationships with minors and that kind of thing, right? But they also have higher standards that extend beyond the law. And these standards are set by states. This is actually a model code of ethics that was just released by NASTEC, which is a national association, which states look to when they're formulating their policies and things like that. But so I think that makes sense to us that teachers should be held to a higher standard than just not breaking the law, right? But then when they start to explain this a little more, we see a couple things that I think are interesting. First of all, this model code of ethics applies to teachers regardless of their personal views. So it doesn't matter what your personal moral views are or your ethical views. Our ethical law is what reigns supreme, which again might not be a problem, might be understandable. Then it's defined for us what this means. So teachers are to refrain from professional or personal activity that may lead to reducing their effectiveness within the school community. That's interesting. And they should also avoid the appearance of impropriety. Now, what this means, though, is that these kinds of standards dictate the ability of the school board to hire and fire people. Now, my reaction when I see that is kind of like Anderson Cooper here. I wonder, what are the implications of that? Well, when I read that, what I read between the lines is that, well, and also in the lines, is that your personal, ethical, moral views don't matter. You're still held to this standard, whatever we say the standard is. You have no right to a personal or private life because professional standards apply to your personal life as well. Ethics and morality are defined in terms of whatever your community thinks. So if your community doesn't like what you're doing, then it's unethical. And propriety is defined by that which it doesn't offend someone. So as long as you're not offending someone, you're proper. If you do offend someone, you're improper. And when I read those things and think about that, it makes me think, well, are we trying to turn all of our teachers into politicians? And politicians in the sense of bad politicians. I'm not making a statement about any of these particular politicians, but it seems like we've come to a place in our society where we expect our teachers not to have a personal life and not to be people, but we expect them to respond to and be malleable to the whims of the community, just like a politician has to be elected. So to give you an example of what this might look like, so in August of 2014, the teacher, Keith Allison, he took a picture of a dairy farm, and basically just took a picture of a calf in a wooden crate. And he basically just said something like this: I had a mom that would not put me in a wooden crate, so I think it's inhumane to put a calf in a human crate. So he's a vegan, he's an animal rights guy. And then he was called into his superintendent's office where he was told that he needed to be very careful about what he puts on Facebook because he might offend the community and the economic interests of the community because it's an agricultural community. And that if he wanted to be a strong vegan advocate, he might want to look into doing something other than teaching. I think that's striking, right? His contract was not renewed that year. That's not a singular case. We have cases of teachers getting disciplined for things that I think from the outside seem pretty bizarre. So you have an instance of a teacher going on a vacation to Italy, going to a vineyard and drinking wine, taking a picture of her drinking wine in a vineyard and posting that to Facebook. That picture gets out and then she's disciplined because she's promoting underage drinking somehow by doing that. But this gets to this issue of there is no personal professional distinction anymore. It's all the same. Now, these are a minority of cases. Obviously, there are cases where teachers do things that I think we would all agree they should be fired for. But when I see this and I think about myself wanting to be an educator and training educators, and when someone is thinking about, well, how should I participate in social media, and they see these kinds of examples of teachers being disciplined for things that just really don't make sense, leads them to wonder, well, am I safe doing things online? What is my identity? How can I share things that may be important to me without getting into trouble? And I think for teachers this is particularly important because one of the traditional purposes of teachers in our society has been to prepare an informed citizenry, to help our students become informed citizens who vote, who have opinions, and who stand up for what they believe. And so if we create a scenario now where teachers cannot do that themselves, how are we allowing them to do that in their professional position? And again, I think the larger implication of this is not just those teachers, these examples of teachers that are getting into trouble, but the overall message that it sends, that teachers can't have opinions anymore. And I think some of this applies to other professions as well. It's not just teachers. I felt some of these tensions as a university professor even, which historically has been a very kind of protected position, right? But you see examples of professors getting into trouble for a 140-character tweet. And then all of a sudden, everyone wants their blood, and they are sometimes they are forced to resign. And so this leads to a situation when we're online, we have an identity, but we are forced to shrink that identity to make it acceptable to everyone else so that we cannot possibly offend anyone else. And I think, being in a religious institution, one of the things that I think about with this is, what impact does this have on my ability to even express my religious views online? Is it possible for people to take offense to my religious views? When I taught in the classroom, there were very clear parameters about what I could and could not do in my classroom, right? So I wouldn't preach to my students. But does that mean then that I can't post a Bible verse to Twitter? These are some of the questions that teachers have to grapple with when they start to realize the professional restrictions that are placed upon them and there is no distinction between personal and professional. Now, some might say like seems kind of hypocritical coming from a BYU professor where you have an honor code that you're held to. But one of the interesting things here that I want to emphasize is that the honor code is different in a few key ways. One is that it's explicit, it's specific. When we talk about moral turpitude with teachers, it's not explicit and specific. It's dependent upon the whims of the community, which aren't defined. It's based on a discernible culture. So if you come to BYU, you know what culture you're coming into. In a school, that's not always clear. It's not always clear that the agricultural community reigns, right? And what the agricultural community wants, that's what you have to abide by. But also, the honor code recognizes its own uniqueness in the sense that we at the university, at BYU, recognize that our norms are not the norms of other people. So we don't just assume that this is common sense. That's why it's explicit. Whereas the way moral turpitude is written and the way these clauses are written and the way teachers are treated by school boards is typically like you've broken these common sense laws that we never said were common sense or that we never made explicit. And then ultimately you have other options. If you don't want to abide by the honor code, you can go to another university. But as a teacher, you are bound to abide by these professional standards no matter where you're teaching. Again, and it may vary by where you teach, but it's not explicit. So I think we have a situation where the technologies that we use empower us as institutions, as people, to have more control and oversight over other people, to have more views of what they're doing, have more access to their private lives. But simultaneously, those tools also encourage us to share more. So we're sharing more and we're watching each other more, while at the same time contextualization is decreased. So there's no context anymore. So if I post a private message on Facebook, that can be forwarded to someone else, that can be copied, that can be sent in an email. And that has happened before, where a teacher has sent a private email to someone and it's forwarded and they're fired for that email. So there's no context for our conversations anymore. And so I think this is a really interesting idea and an important issue, because one of the problems we're facing right now, I think, is that we have come to think of identity in a very monolithic kind of way. We kind of think that any information that I find about Scott is Scott's identity, and that's how and I can judge Scott by any information that I find about him. But I think as I've come to think about identity more, one of the metaphors that I've come to appreciate is the concept of like an identity constellation, in the sense that when you're at home, you're going to act one way. When you're at school, you're going to act another. When you're at church, you're going to act another. It's not that you're a different person in each place, but the way that you act is slightly different. And your identity is your understanding of how all those pieces fit together, like a constellation, right? The problem, though, is that if I say something in confidence at home, what happens now if that is put into a church setting or in a school setting? And that's what's happening with social media. To build off of that, another issue that I think is really important is brought up by this quote, which I love. It's talking about the value of a small community versus a large community. And it's kind of counterintuitive to what we're fed sometimes. And the author here states that the person who lives in a small community lives in a larger world, in the sense that you're forced to deal with the fierce varieties and uncompromising divergences of men. From a biblical perspective, it's kind of similar to the concept of love thy neighbor. That's such a strong commandment because you have no control over who your neighbor is. You're just commanded to love them no matter who they are. In the same sense, in a small community, you're forced to deal with the people that are around you. In a large community, in a big society, you're able to form cliques. You're able to connect with like-minded people that are just like you and to exclude others. Now, this was written by G.K. Chesterton in 1905, but I think it applies to social media, because in these spaces, we are able to control our experiences. We control who we follow, and we can control who follows us. And what that means is that we can control the experiences that we have. We can not only control who connects with us, but also what resources we access. So I can just choose to go to Fox News every day, and that's my view of the world. Or I could choose to go to Huffington Post every day, and that's my view of the world. The technologies allow us to cocoon ourselves in our own biases and not open ourselves to dissenting view. So if someone disagrees with you on Facebook, there's just one click and they can't see what you're saying anymore, right? Now, as an educated white male on Twitter, if I look at my followers, probably going to be a lot of educated white males. Do I follow educated white males? If so, that's a problem, because it means that I'm having my own biases reified. Now, it's not just social media, though. The algorithms and structures that structure our experience on the internet also support this. So you think about a company like Google. Their whole purpose is to feed you information that you want, which typically means that they are reifying your biases. If you do a search for gun control and Google knows what your stance is on gun control, it's going to give you the information that you want to know about gun control, and and so forth. So as these systems become more complex and they have good understanding of who we are and what we want, it further cocoons us in these shells. Now, I think that's really important because now we also hear lots of rhetoric about civility and discourse and how we need to be a more civil society, but no one's talking about why we're uncivil in the first place and why we're acting this way. And so much of it, I think, comes from these tools that allow us to cocoon ourselves in our own biases and not have to deal with the realities of personal interaction with people that we may not agree with. Now, on the other side of that, though, social media provides lots of opportunities for expanding and I think improving upon the academic enterprise. So because of social media in particular, we've come to a place now as a society where there are such things as academic rock stars. There are people that in a traditional setting would be thoroughly cocooned within the ivory tower who now have wide audiences. People follow, people know who they are. I think we have some in this college that are like that. And so it allows us, I think, in many ways to move past an ivory tower mentality of education and higher education in particular, and really think about the role of the professor and the teacher in society, and think about our outreach and how we can support society. So, the last note on this, I really think it's a problem as a society that it seems like we're moving toward a view of morality, ethics, and civility that is defined by that which doesn't offend anyone. I think throughout history you can find examples of great people who did amazing things that offended some other people. Here are 4 examples. So Christ, Galileo, Martin Luther King Jr., and Joseph Smith. All of these men were killed specifically because they offended someone. And so if we are defining morality by offense, then I think that's a problem. So some of the concrete research questions that I've asked in this area have to do with how do teachers construct their identity in social media? What tensions exist between their social media use and professionalism? How do university students and instructors use social media? How is scholarship changing in response to social media? How is the institution changing? And then how can social media support teaching and learning? So that's the first area, and this idea of mediated identities. Now the second area of interest, and as I said at the beginning, I'm just dumping stuff on you, so I apologize. So this is completely different. It has to do with open literacies. And open literacies, if any of you have ever heard Dave Wiley talk, you know what this is, or you know what openness is, you know what OER is. But it's based on the idea of sharing, that technologies exist and should exist to help us to share more effectively. And one way that we can do that is to rethink some of our traditional norms of intellectual property and how we share content and resources. The open education movement has gained a lot of steam because there's been so much waste or perceived waste in education that can be addressed by making things more efficient and more open. One of the ways that this happens is by openly licensing content. So things like open educational resources, open textbooks, which allow us to drastically drive down the cost of these resources. So whereas if you were a professor before, you had an astronomy book that was $130 per book, you can now direct your students to an openly licensed textbook that is free that they could print off for $5. So open textbooks are kind of the poster child for openness. But with this, my research interests really revolve around 2 things. One is this issue of just because something is open doesn't mean that it's going to be used the way that we want or by the people that we want. And there's a great paper written a few years ago called The Romance of the Public Domain, where it was argued that we kind of tell ourselves these narratives that when we give things away or put things in a public place, that we do so for the public good. But the question is, who actually benefits from that? And one example that's provided is the continent of Africa. If you go back in history to colonialism, Africa was treated as a public place by the European powers. It's basically up for grabs. And there was no question of the local Africans and what they thought about that. But from a European perspective, is up for grabs. So who benefited from that openness of the continent? It wasn't the locals. It wasn't the poor Europeans. It was the wealthy Europeans who had the power and the prestige and the resources necessary to go in and exploit it. In the same way, we need to think about how can we empower people to make use of open educational resources? So what literacies do they need to develop? What do teachers need to understand to even use this in their classroom? How do we teach them about important things like copyright, open licensing, and how to adapt these materials? And because it is a significant shift for them. So I've done some work in this, and working with teachers in particular, but one of the things that comes out of this is that the benefits of openness far extend beyond cost. And we kind of become fixated on cost in some ways, and I think that's okay from a diffusion perspective, in the sense that if we want to get like a legislator on board to help us move to openness, then that's often what you need to hit on. But there are other benefits to openness that are very, very important, and that from a teacher's perspective are even more important than cost. One of the studies that we did showed that the teachers we were working with recognized very quickly that a move to openness allowed for the access to resources to be much more equitable between subject areas and between schools. So whereas previously, at least in recent years, STEM gets all of the emphasis, now a move to open allows resources to be evenly distributed. It promotes teacher-teacher collaboration. And I think most interestingly, it allows for student differentiation, which is a huge buzzword right now in education, but no one really knows how to do it well. But the concept that you have to teach your students in Utah out of a textbook written for Texas doesn't make any sense. Why can't you take a textbook and modify it to be suitable for Utah, or to your specific community in Utah, or to your specific students in your class? In a traditional textbook publishing model, you can't do that. You can't take your textbook and change the reading level, change the locality of it, or anything like that without breaking the law. But a shift to openness allows us to differentiate our resources for our students and our locations. And when teachers realize this is their response. Because it's a completely different way of thinking. Instead of being the subjects or the servants of the content that they're being given from the state, they can become the creators and the curators of content themselves. Another study we did looked at quality, and this is a big issue with OER, or at least people want it to be a big issue. Textbook companies want it to be a big issue. But one of the things that we found was that in our study, as teachers actually used open textbooks and as they adapted them, they found that the open textbooks were of higher quality than copyright restricted textbooks they were using before. But then also, as they were doing that, as they were adapting them to their locality, they became even better, to the point that in some of these metrics, the adapted textbook was twice as good as the copyright textbook. They rated it twice as highly. So you can view this in a lot of ways. One way you can view it is that the system is breaking down. An oppressive system is being replaced by one that is more open, which I think is really exciting. But I think that coming out of this, my interest is thinking through how do we make sure that we are working with the right people to help them to gain the full benefit of openness. So some of the questions that I've asked in my research in the past are, what are the greatest benefits for teachers afforded by openness? What are the greatest challenges? What barriers do they face when they try to do this kind of thing in their district? Does the romance of the public domain actually exist? Is there a discrepancy between the wealthy and the highly educated, those with resources and those without, in terms of what resources they access? How do we help teachers develop open literacies, and how do we evaluate the quality of OER? Now the last area that I'm going to talk about, so this is the third section, is I think we need to rethink how we approach educational research in light of the internet. And as I alluded to at the beginning, we have access to more information than anyone in history. And how are we using that information? I think we can use it in some pretty interesting ways to address traditional educational problems. I think Wikipedia is an amazing example. No matter what you think about Wikipedia, I think how many of you have ever used Wikipedia? So everybody, right? Wikipedia is incredible. Just the English version of Wikipedia constitutes over 5 million articles. written by over 26 million people. If you were to print out all of the English Wikipedia, this is how many volumes you would have. It's an insane amount of work. Anyone ever read like Isaac Asimov and the Foundation series? Like one of the goals they had for hundreds of years was to create an encyclopedia that contains all of human knowledge. Wikipedia has done that in 15 or 20 years, or it's getting very close. And it's incredible just how much content is there. All of this content is released under a Creative Commons license, so you can do whatever you want with it. You could even print this off and sell it. As a teacher, you could create a textbook just from Wikipedia content, and you could sell that. It's incredible what's there. And interestingly enough, as I said before, with regard to how much computer power we have, you have the power on just a simple desktop to download all of Wikipedia and to install it and analyze it on your computer. Because I've done it. You can do it. Another thing that I think is really powerful and interesting is the idea of being able to track what students and teachers are actually doing. Right now, all the literature on how students and teachers use the internet and how it impacts learning is really all based on either classroom observations, so it's very small, finite groups of people, or in surveys. Each of those have huge problems. One of the things that we can do and that we've done is we can anonymously track what students and teachers are doing online over a long period of time. So in this study, we tracked K-12 students and teachers for the course of an entire year. And again, it was anonymous, so there's no worry of their privacy being breached. But from that, we can start to develop understandings of what resources do teachers and students use? How is that connected to learning outcomes and other types of outcomes that are valuable to us? Another data source that is really rich are K-12 websites and university websites. These are all public resources that aren't being used in any research way. Well, you can go and you can download these websites and you can analyze them and find meaningful information. For instance, you can figure out what learning management systems are being used by schools. So in my last state, we did this with every school website in this state, and we were able to determine what the diffusion of these learning management systems were. We were then able to merge that with student learning outcomes on standardized achievement tests, and we were able to question the narrative being given to schools from learning management system companies that the system improves student learning, because we were able to show at scale what were the actual effects of learning management system adoption on student achievement. Yeah?
So did you get the student outcomes from the schools? How did you do that?
So this was very blunt. It was the student outcomes that are reported to the state.
So they're just average numbers.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
not individual data.
Right, right. But it was to counterbalance the narrative, again, given by companies like Blackboard that will come in and say, our product has increased test scores in this district 70%. If that's true, then we should see that across the state. And we didn't see that. University websites are another interesting one. And then also Twitter. Twitter is fascinating because it has an open API that allows you access to a wealth of information. Anyone can go and create an account to download data from Twitter, and you can download really the 3,500 most recent tweets of anyone on Twitter. And so from this, some of the research studies that I've done so far have to do with what does open online collaboration look like? How do teachers and students actually use the web? And what are large-scale impacts of tech adoption on student learning? And then most recently with Twitter, we've been studying how do scholars, students, and institutions use social media. So to give you a very concrete understanding of what I'm currently doing and what I plan to do in the near future, one of the current studies things that I'm exploring is how do scholars, educators, students, and educational institutions use social media, and what are the effects and implications? To give you a sense of the size of this data set, right now we have over 100 million tweets that we're analyzing, again, that were just pulled from Twitter. And it's growing daily. That represent every university in Canada, every university and community college in the US, and hundreds of scholars and educators. And this can expand very quickly. All this is done on a simple desktop computer, because we have more processing power than NASA did in '69. Another area of interest that we're working on right now is what are the diffusion patterns of OER? Again, looking at school websites, university websites at scale, and what is going on with OER, who is using them, how do we teach people to use them, and then how do we teach people to use them more effectively? Within these, I think one of the themes is that we need to think outside of our traditional norms of sampling and think about what is possible. So if we have public access to every K-12 and university website in the United States, then we can draw some pretty strong conclusions about some of these questions that we're asking. So we don't have to deal with a very small sample. We can get the complete population. Some other questions that I'm interested in asking in the near future are what factors govern diffusion of open source software among K-12 and higher education institutions? I already wrote a paper on this on the state of Idaho, but want to expand it to the entire US. And how accessible are institutional websites for all learners? So universal design and accessibility, ADA compliance are all huge issues right now, and they have been for a long time. But there's no understanding about how universities make their resources accessible and how accessible are they at scale. And then what are national diffusion patterns of technology adoption in schools, and what are the effects? Again, looking at kind of those large scale issues. I think you can get and look at some design issues here as well. But then also this idea of using learning analytics and tracking, we can also ask questions like how do teachers and students actually use the web at scale? How does this align with the perceptions of use? So comparing that to what they're telling us. So what students are reporting in terms of how often they use Facebook might be very different than what they're actually doing. And then we can figure out how does that relate to their student outcomes? How does that relate to their happiness? And we can determine, does your use of Facebook make you a happier person? How do K-12 teachers use social media? How do EdTech scholars and students use social media? And with all of these, we can get huge data sets from these sources. And I think this is the last one. Then also this issue of homophilia that I mentioned before, this idea of us isolating ourselves and cocooning ourselves from dissenting opinion. Can we detect that? Because as of yet, it hasn't been empirically verified by the research. And so I think we can do that. And then what factors determine civility in online discourse? A final study that I'm also planning on is looking very specifically at specific communities. And I'm interested in how members of the church use social media. How is social media used to support religious identity? And we can do that, again, at large scale by focusing on specific hashtags or specific cultural, but also in response to specific cultural events. So when we hear a conference talk that we're invited to do certain things with social media, do members actually do that at scale? I think all of this requires us to think in a new way about ethics, because a lot of this is uncharted territory in terms of research methodologies. And so we need, through this process, to establish some guidelines and considerations for ethical uses of these types of technologies for research. So I warned you at the beginning that would be a fire hose. Hopefully you're still awake. But I do think we are in a very interesting place now that can help us to fundamentally rethink what is possible in terms of educational research and what is possible in terms of addressing some of the traditional problems we have had. And just thinking about the resources that are available to you, just as a simple consumer, it's astronomical what you could potentially do with that. And so my encouragement is just to think creatively about what is possible given all the resources that we have available to us, even in your own dorm room or home or office. And that's it. Thank you so much. And again, all this, if there's any study that's interesting to you, you can check it out on my website and also talk to me. Thank you.
One of the themes I saw during your presentation, and just in general, was that our hardware is far more advanced than our software, so to speak. We have far more computing power than we even know what to do with. If you had a magic wand and could have teachers in the entire world do something different with technology, what would it be?
So I teach the undergrad, the teachers now, the pre-service teachers. And one of the themes that laces itself through everything that I try to do with them is to become critical about their technology use, and critical consumers of it. So to think through what are the implications of what I'm doing in the classroom, and am I using the resources that I have in a way that ultimately leads to better learning or a better experience for my students. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think generally speaking in teacher education, we have a problem where we overemphasize computer skills and how to develop, how to use a specific website or specific tool, and don't give sufficient time and energy to that critical aspect of it that allows our teachers to be thoughtful about how they're using technology to actually improve the experiences for their students. And we've heard that feedback from the districts as well, that that's what they're seeing. Especially younger teachers coming in, they're much more excited about using technology, and that's traditionally viewed as a good thing. And a lot of folks will tell you that, like, well, I've heard this said of higher ed, that innovation occurs one retirement at a time. I don't think that's true, but people take that same view in K-12, and they think that the older teachers just don't want to try new stuff. They're kind of set in their ways. But the issue isn't that the older teachers are less innovative, it's that they've been around longer and they recognize bandwagons when they see them. And so what happens is our younger teachers jump on bandwagons, and then we don't see any educational outcomes from that. And then that just reifies the older teachers in that wasn't useful to begin with. So I think we need to find a nice balance between the excitement of using new tech, but then also the critical aspect of it, of evaluating its usefulness in teaching and learning. Thank you.
I've got a question from from Jason. It says, does the future of OER include open and free access to music, books, plays, etc.?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, OER is part of, there are lots of different movements that are all kind of connected together in some kind of mystical way. So like there's OER, and then there's open source software, and then there's like the open culture movement. And so I think that you have people coming from lots of different sides of this that are seeing some of the same things. So there's value in sharing. And so Creative Commons wasn't specifically designed for education. It was designed for media, just sharing media, improving creative works. And so I think that, yeah, absolutely, there will be more and more types of creative works that will be shared via OER. Yeah, does that answer the question? Go ahead.
Kind of off of that, I'm just wondering about your opinion with Creative Commons. One of them that I think about is the part where it says that you can't do this as a commercial, you can't use it. What's your opinion on that? Is that something that should be included in everything, or are you like...
Yeah. Well, so Creative Commons, if you don't know, they have the base license that basically allows you to do anything as long as you cite them, but then they have more restrictive licenses as they go on. And the reason I think for doing that is so that anyone who wants to share can share in a way that they're comfortable with. If you don't care what people do, why not just release your stuff in the public domain, and then it doesn't matter. Like, you don't even need to be cited. And so I think different people have different levels of comfort with what they want to do. So like for teachers, for instance, one of the concerns that I might have if I was a teacher developing lesson plans and releasing those in Creative Commons, I wouldn't want a company to be able to come and take those lesson plans, package them into a book, and sell that book. Does that make sense? I mean, I want people to use it, but I don't want other people I don't want a corporation to benefit financially from the work that I'm doing as an underpaid teacher, right? So I think there's value to the different levels. Personally, like in terms of like what I release and what licenses I release them under, I think there are reasons for releasing things under different kinds of licenses. So like if I create a whole course, then yeah, I might release that under a Creative Commons license that doesn't allow for commercial use. But if on the other hand, if I'm just putting a video out there, then I'm not going to care, because what's the likelihood someone's going to use it for that anyway, and I really don't care if it's just a video that they're going to use. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the levels exist for a reason, and I think that what it allows many more people to participate in the sharing process than would be possible if we just said you have to do CC BY or you can't do anything at all.
Let's give Royce a big round of applause.